In 2024, who could have surprise playing time roles for the Philadelphia Eagles, and who has a better chance to make this 53-man roster than we're giving them credit for? Some kick return talk, all that and more coming your way on this Thursday edition of Locked On Eagles.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome on in, Eagles fans, to this Thursday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. I'm Louis DiBiase, joined as always by my co-host Gino Camilleri. You can also find our work over at Bleacher Report on today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. We're going to get into some surprise roles for players that maybe we're not giving enough credit that could play a lot in 2024. Same thing for players that might have a better shot of making this overall roster than we're thinking with our 53-man roster predictions, plus some kickoff return talk, all that and more. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL. You're going to get $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. And, Gino, this started because I did my 53-man roster predictions a few weeks ago. OTAs have started, and you know, I think every year there's guys we really get into and assume the Eagles have big plans for or they have roster locks for. I have my own personal bias against certain styles of players that I say they're going to, maybe it's more the heart saying they're going to be a bigger part of this team than the head is saying. And then suddenly the Eagles have different plans and they go in different directions, right? I mean, there's always surprise cuts and players that have surprise roles on this team every single year. I think this year there could be some guys, like how I thought about this too was because yesterday, and it was only day one of OTAs, but Zack Baun was getting first team linebacker snaps with Devin White as an inside stand-up linebacker as opposed to being more on the edge, which is where we thought he was going to play. It's where he was more effective with the New Orleans Saints. Of course, that could still be the role that plays out. Again, it was only one day of practice, but that's also what made me think of this topic is I'm like, all right, I've been assuming it's Mekhi Garner, Devin White, if not one of them, Jeremiah Trotter Jr. is going to push them. But Vic Fangio's like, hold on. I mean, what about a Zack Baun? If I trust him in my scheme, maybe he's a guy that plays more than I think.
When I'm looking at those positions that you're probably going to add some of those depth type of players, especially from a special teams element, it comes down to more than likely that linebacker role. Because what does Vic Fangio want in these backers? Like you said, is Zack Baun going to be an inside stand-up type of guy, or is he going to be an off-ball type of backer? I think you're going to see a lot of packages where there's only one or two linebackers on the field. They're going to go defensive back heavy. But if you get into that argument of where do they keep these guys, I think there's players like Oren Burks at the linebacker position that they had signed specifically to be a special teams type of ace. But a player that I have kind of tongue-in-cheek thrown jokes at saying, like, is he going to be the guy? Ben Van Summeren at the linebacker position, it seems that this team really likes this kid. He seems to do everything for them when it comes to just taking on any role. He started to pick up snaps out of basically necessity, not really that he had the skill set to go and do it last year, but they didn't have anybody else at linebacker. But he's in year two. There's nobody really set in stone there. Who's to say that he doesn't have a great preseason? Vic Fangio falls in love with the kid, and all of a sudden, he's getting more rotational snaps than we expected out of him.
No, it's a great point. I think there's a couple linebackers, and we mentioned three behind the big three we've been talking about a lot that could end up playing more than we think. Again, it's a new defensive coordinator, and he's new to all these players. And, you know, of course, he was part of bringing in Devin White and bringing in pretty much everybody here, but he didn't draft Mekhi Garner. So maybe, I don't know, maybe Mekhi Garner, if he doesn't impress him in the summer, he's not married to that idea of having him be his green dot, play caller for the defense. Like, that's a very important role. I mean, I think Mekhi Garner would be the betting favorite still to have that position, Gino. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up being somebody else. There were so many years where I said it was going to be somebody that's not named TJ Edwards, and it kept becoming TJ Edwards.
I'll be intrigued to see how Vic Fangio picks his linebacker to be the green dot guy, because is there a chance it could be Devin White? There's always a possibility. Would the best bet in the best scenario for this football team be that Mekhi Garner is the guy? 100%. because you know that third round pick you invested will hopefully come to life in year 3 and he will take that next jump. 2, I think he has all of the traits that you really want outside of being a little undersized. He has the explosive element to his game. He has the ability to track sideline to sideline. He can make plays coming downhill. As opposed to the rest of the guys that you have, he has that higher ceiling for you. And if he does get that role, well, then you can put these guys like Zack Baun and the rest of these guys who belong in more of a role-playing type of position in roles that they should be playing, because you don't want to elevate a guy into a role that he shouldn't be in, and having guys like Justin Evans be out there for you like they had at safety last year, where you're saying hopefully he doesn't have a role, and then all of a sudden he does have a big role for you.
Yeah, and that was more on necessity, but you're right, Gino. Like, that's a perfect example of this conversation playing out. Justin Evans was a guy I thought had no shot of being someone getting defensive snaps early on in the season for that roster, and he was. So hopefully this scenario would be the same, where it's more based on necessity than preference, than a Zack Baun had to play stand-up inside linebacker, or a Burks, or a Ben Van Summeren. Overall, we would want it to be one of those top 3, and that's why we highlight them: Cooper DeJean, Devin White, and Jeremiah Trotter Jr. I think a guy on offense, you look at tight end, Gino, behind Dallas Goedert, it's a free-for-all, and Albert O has maybe the best receiving skills of any of the guys behind Goddard, but last year barely played at all for Philadelphia. It was like a healthy scratch the majority of the year after trading for him. You did bring in CJ Uzomah. I think Grant Calcaterra might end up being a guy that, with Jack Stahl gone, and again, it's not exciting to think about any of these players having a role, but Calcaterra might end up, he's the one that's been here for a while and might be the most reliable pass catcher. I'm not sure, but Calcaterra is someone I don't think is getting talked about a lot.
Going into year 3, he really does have to take that step, because his roster spot, I would say, is not set in stone right now.
Not at all. None of them should be.
Jack Stoll leaving, that does give him a little bit of a boost, that he is the only guy who really saw meaningful snaps for you outside of Dallas Goedert in 2023. And the times he has been a threat in the passing game, Lou, you could see why they drafted him in the 5th round that year, that he had that ability to make 2 or 3 catches in a game, be some sort of a mismatch type of player that can play opposite of Dallas Goedert. But you look at this room, it's Grant Calcaterra, McAllen Castles, who they paid that major UDFA deal. I believe they gave him $250,000 guaranteed. EJ Jenkins, who's a second-year player out of Georgia Tech, Albert O, and CJ Uzomah. Is it just going to be CJ Uzomah because he's a 10-year player and you could rely on him like you did a couple years ago with Richard Rodgers? Like, is that? But I don't know, because they're going to take.
They didn't take it with Jack Arnold last year, or Dan Arnold.
Dan Arnold, yeah, you combine Jack Stoll and Dan Arnold, right? Yeah. And I think Calcaterra is going to be given all the ability and all of the chance to be the number 2. And if he doesn't win that role, that's a huge testament to what this team thinks about him. And if he can't step up to be that guy, there's no other threat here at the pass-catching tight end position. But if they start to throw guys out there in these sub-package situations where in the slot they're not going these 12 personnel looks, they're going more multiple running backs out there, or they're going multiple slot receivers instead of throwing that tight end out there, probably Grant Calcaterra's got the biggest, or arguably the most, to lose on offense of any guy probably in that building right now, because what is the one position that's up for grabs? It's clearly tight end number 2. Wide receiver 3, once you get past the big 2 guys, it's like, yeah, we know that it's going to go through AJ and Avonte. But that second tight end, they've been trying to replace that since they moved on from Zach Ertz, and they have not found a guy.
I think on defense, too, Avonte Maddox is a player that me and you have been talking more like there's not a lot of guarantees in that 1-year contract. They brought in Cooper DeJean. They have a lot of young corners. Could you trade him? Could you cut him? Maybe he is still on this roster, Gino, but he's not in the role of the full-time every down corner that he's been over the last few years. Then you look at how OTAs have started, and not only is Avonte Maddox with the first team, and again, take this all with a grain of salt. This is reacting from one day of practice, but not only was he the first team slot corner, Gino, but Vic Fangio was moving him around the formation, like playing him at safety. And when you think about how thin they are at safety, when you think about Sidney Brown's injury and Cooper DeJean coming along, they're probably going to want to keep him at just one position. Maddox might not only be somebody that plays ahead of a lot of these guys we prefer to be on the field, but he might be playing multiple spots, at least early on in the season when they don't have a lot of cross-trained safety corner hybrids.
On the Eagles website, it's very intriguing that they only list him as a cornerback because they have Cooper DeJean listed as a defensive back.
Mm-hmm.
He's the only one listed as a defensive back, which is also interesting. At safety, you only have 5 guys, or Reed Blankenship, Sidney Brown, C.J. Gardner-Johnson, Tristan McCollum, and Andre Sam. So one of those guys at the cornerback position, if they're just saying, okay, let me look at the numbers, let me do some early onset accounting here, I'm probably better off being a versatile defensive back in a Vic Fangio style scheme where these type of players have picked up roles across multiple defenses for Vic Fangio. If I'm Avonte Maddox, that's what your agent should have been telling you from day one of your signing back to Philadelphia, that if you want to take on a role and have a chance, not to just make this roster, but contribute, you're going to have to go back to rookie Avonte Maddox, who this Eagles team saw as a versatile piece who could play more than just inside corner. Folks forget, Lou, that not only did he just play, or not only did he move to safety in that rookie year, he was also tried out at outside corner.
I was going to say at the end of the year. Well, Gino, at the end of the year in 2018 during that playoff run, it was him and Rasul Douglas on the outside for a month and a half. And even in 2020, Jim Schwartz went back to that idea of playing Avonte on the outside, and in the 2019 playoff game against Seattle. So yeah, Maddox has moved across the formation in the past, and you're right. For him to stick on this roster in a jam-packed DB room, he's got to be able to wear many hats. So I think we're assuming sometimes that he's not going to be on this roster, but maybe he is, and maybe he has a bigger role than we think. But again, then there's the injuries, so you got to have a plan B for sure, if that is the plan A moving forward. I kind of want to keep on this topic coming up next, but switch gears and talk about players that might have a better shot to just make the overall roster more than we think. Maybe not have a starting or play a lot of playing time in 2024, but a guy that can make the roster more than people are saying. We'll get into that coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by Yahoo Finance. Wouldn't it be great if you could see all your investments and retirement accounts in just one place? Well, with Yahoo Finance, you can consolidate your views from multiple accounts into one hub and access the expert analysis you need to tend to your entire portfolio with confidence. For more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand every great investor looks for. Whether you're a seasoned investor or looking for that extra guidance, Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data you need in one place. They're the #1 finance destination, producing a holistic look at the financial news cycle, including breaking news, original editorial perspectives, analyst ratings, independent research, customizable charts, and so much more. Securely link your brokerage accounts for a unified view of your wealth, including 401ks and other investments. A comprehensive perspective is what sets apart great investors. That's how Yahoo Finance ensures you have the insight to look at your wealth in its entirety. So make sure you head over to yahoofinance.com for your comprehensive financial news and analysis. It's the brand every great investor looks for. The #1 financial destination, yahoofinance.com. That's yahoofinance.com. Thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day, got to turn down the volume with all the shouting. Make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, Gino, I feel like there's guys that, every year you look at August and when it's time to get this roster down from 90 to 53, and it's not as strenuous of a process as it used to be. Like, there's just one day now where they get that whole roster down. Sometimes there's players who are like, wow, did not expect him to make this football team. I think there is some guys this year on both sides of the ball that have a real good opportunity that we're not even really talking about a lot. Like, let's talk about the DB room. There's so many guys, but talk about a cross-trained player that came out of college as a corner that played some safety last year that could have a shot to make this roster and on special teams be a contributor. Like Mekhi Garner is someone that I don't think people are talking about a lot, but has the size and the length to be a safety, and they did switch him from corner to safety last year at one point. So he's a guy that when people are doing their 53-man roster predictions early on, I don't really see on there a lot, but I could see him being on this team.
Mekhi Garner, Mario Goodrich, Tristan McCollum,
Goodrich.
All three of those young guys, they were cross-trained players for the Eagles last year in a young defensive back room. Now with a little bit more talent in that room, you had guys like Tyler Hall, who's a fourth-year player at that slot cornerback position, who we haven't really talked about either. Sean Stevens, undrafted free agent, who this team adds. He's smaller. He's a defensive back, can play cornerback, can play safety. One of these guys is going to step up, Lou, and I think one of them is going to sneak themselves onto the roster because the talking point is at this cornerback position, we know that you aren't going to be one of the big 3 or 4 guys there. You're not going to be Darius Slay. You're not a player like Quinion, who they just drafted. Heck, you're not even an Isaiah Rodgers, who they have big things for planned moving forward. Same with Keely Ringo. But on the back half, behind Eli Ricks, behind a Josh Jobe, what is there? Is anything set in stone? One of those guys is going to separate themselves from the group. And you look at Mekhi Garner, it's only his second year. He's still on that rookie contract. They trusted him at times, though. They were bringing him along late into that season. Either him or Goodrich or McCollum, who they trusted. I don't think one of those guys... I think one of those guys is going to end up being a Philadelphia Eagle at the end of the day, because you talk about the special teams element. You talk about the lack of versatile players on that back end. If one of them can separate themselves, that's how they're going to work their way onto this team.
You mentioned Tyler Hall, too. That's a player that almost nobody ever mentions at corner. They brought in from the Raiders that has some playtime experience, almost as much as Isaiah Rodgers does. Like, he wasn't as good as Rodgers in that playing time, but Tyler Hall played a lot of minutes in the slot for the Raiders over the last few years. So that's a guy that it reminds me of when they had, and he was cut pretty quick because he had some off-the-field issues he ran into, but it was that year that they had Darby and Mills and Razul and Maddox, Cravon LeBlanc. Like, the team was loaded with Sidney Jones. It was 2019. And then they brought in, I think his name was it Daryl Worley? Gino, do you remember this corner that I'm talking about?
Daryl Worley from did they get him from the Raiders at the time, or was he from Carolina?
So. Or Carolina.
Yeah,
he's from Carolina.
Yes, and then he went to one of those teams after Philadelphia. Yes. I know that.
That was a guy that, if he didn't get into trouble, might have had a good shot to make the roster. And that's kind of how I feel with Hall here. It's a guy that maybe Fangio does want another guy that has experience playing in the slot, especially with Maddox's injury history. All your other options are young and experienced players. I wouldn't love if he made the roster, but yeah, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned him too, because that's another name that really is just not brought up at all. And they brought him in here.
The defensive back room is probably going to have the most amount of questions on that back half. Who's going to be the guy that cements themselves? Linebacker probably as well, because you throw guys like Brandon Smith into the equation, second-year player out of Penn State, Oren Burks, who they signed as
during the draft.
I know you did. That's why I'm like, could he sneak his way onto the roster as well?
I could see it.
I think wide receiver as well, Lou, is another position where it's like, which one of these guys is going to separate themselves? Is it going to be, heck, an Austin Watkins Jr., who they bring in off of a team's practice squad last year from UAB?
Who killed
big
the Eagles
body.
in that preseason game, if you remember.
Dominated them, remember that? Yeah, there you go. Jacob Harris, former 5th-round pick, former CGS guy as well.
Yeah.
Third-year player out of UCF. He's built like a tight end, but he's a wide receiver as well. Joseph Nada, throw him into that equation. There's a lot of those guys, Lou, where if just one of them shows anything promising in the preseason, this isn't a situation like you had said back in 2019, like at corner, where you know your guys, and none of them are going to make the roster, even if they have a big showing, or running back any of the last 2 years, where it's like, as good as Trey Sermon was, he wasn't sneaking his way onto the roster.
Right.
The Eagles have done that the last couple years, where we were saying, hey, Devin Allen, push yourself onto the roster to be a 5th or 6th option guy. Well, they don't have those type of players anymore. One of them is going to have to beat out the other guys. Same with running back. Like, could Kendall Milton sneak his way onto the roster, Lou? I know you liked him
Maybe.
coming out of Georgia.
I like
and
Milton.
They don't have Boston Scott anymore. There's positions up for grab on this roster, and could you sneak your way into week 14 or 15 being a contributor? Because that's what it's going to be. If you're on this 53-man roster, this team sees you playing at some point in these 17 games.
And Gino, special teams is so important for these guys to earn a roster spot, whether it's in coverage, as a gunner, as a returner, you name it. Like, there's a lot of roles that you can earn on special teams. And I think returner is an area these guys can get on the 53 by having some success there. I want to get into those return options coming up next, right here as we wrap up things on this Thursday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
As we continue to roll along, this episode is brought to you by our friends over at GameTime.co. We know that the NFL schedule just came out. I'm sure you and everybody in your family and your group of friends is saying, hey, we got to get to a game. We got to get to at least one in Lincoln Financial Field. We got to get to one outside of Lincoln Financial Field. Heck, you want to go down to New Orleans? Well, there's only one place that we go to get our tickets, and that is at Game Time. So right now, go and download that Game Time app to look for whatever tickets you want to get. If you want to go to a comedy show, me and my wife, I like to take her to the theater every once in a while. You can grab tickets no matter what your cup of tea is. You can get a panoramic view of your seat in the app even before clicking into the ticket. It's the lowest price guaranteed, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Right now, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed.
All right, Eagles fans, we're wrapping up this Thursday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast, and we're getting into the back end of the roster. Who's got a better shot than we think of making the 53? Who's got a better chance to have a role on offense and defense as a player that might not be a starter, but they get some snaps this year? I think you mentioned, guys like Zack Baun, Avonte Maddox, Grant Calcaterra, guys that have a better chance to make the roster than we think, like, Mekhi Garner, Tyler Hall, Kendall Milton, like the list goes on. There's going to be some really great battles this summer at Eagles training camp. And one battle that I am very intrigued by on special teams is not the punt return game, because Britain Covey was statistically like the best punt returner in football last year.
Yep.
And it's great. We've come a long way from, we had some bad years in Philadelphia with kickoff returns, punt returns. It was pretty abysmal.
Was Kenyon Barner the last kick returner that
Yes.
really made a difference for the Eagles?
In 2017. Yeah, they went from 2018 to 2022. They went 5 years where it was really, really bad. Now, of course, they've got Britain Covey set in stone at one spot. However, he hasn't been somebody that returns kicks, Gino, and there's a lot of good options there. Like, you look at Cooper DeJean, had a lot of success at Iowa. You look at Ainias Smith. Like, the list goes on. I'm very intrigued to see who ends up being the returners, especially with the new rules. That's more important of a position now than it has been over the years.
I think you could throw Will Shipley into that equation
Will
as well.
Shipley,
Don't count out those lacrosse players in close areas making
Great
guys
point.
miss, man. And I think the new evolution of the kickoff rules are going to play into the hands of what Britain Covey does really well. And if you look at the old playoff or the old kickoff versus the new kickoff, the old kickoff system, you want guys with straight line speed. That's why we're saying, hey, Devin Allen, like, push your way onto this roster. You're a Olympic hurdler. Can you get that straight end speed? Get into your acceleration, get downfield, make one guy miss and hit home. Now, these returners, the guys that are going to be blocking, you can't really move. The guys that are going to be covering the kick are going to be way closer. There's going to be a lot of these in a phone booth type of battles. That's where Britain Covey made his money as a punt returner.
Put him as a kick returner?
I think he's got to be the first guy to get both opportunities, and Cooper DeJean is going to challenge him, and so is Will Shipley, and I think so is Ainias Smith. But right now, set in stone is definitely punt returner. Kick returner, though, that's going to be wide open, man. You got a lot of options there now that have that short area quickness, can make guys miss in a phone booth. Those smaller type of players, those Ainias Smiths, man, that would be great if he can go out there right away and
I
make a
agree.
role for himself as a returner and just say, all right, this is what I can do. Find a way to get me on this offense. See what I can do as a special teamer. Hey, how can these traits translate to the offensive playbook?
Yeah, I would really like if one of the rookies could really take hold of that spot, Gino. And I think DeJean had a lot of success at Iowa as a returner. There were a few games they won because he took one back to the house. But
Yeah, they don't score many points on offense there. Yeah, it's special
right.
teams.
That's such a good point. Cooper DeJean, though, is somebody that eventually you'll want to have a big role in defense, even in 2024 for the Eagles. So I would really hope, and Ainias Smith could be wide receiver 3, Will Shipley could be running back 2, but I think those guys are going to be more of the role-playing type this year anyway, so I would love if those guys could really create that role for themselves as a kick returner. But it's great to know that you've got them, and if nobody really takes that step, you can say, hey, let's take our elite punt returner, and as you mentioned, Gino, let's put him as a kick returner too. It's not like we need to really reserve him to be a starting receiver. And I really agree with you with the rule changes. Like, that does change the style of player you need. You need a guy that can bob and weave a little bit more, and that definitely is Covey. So I would be intrigued if they said, hey, let's just go all out and just have Covey be our return specialist in both areas. But even if they don't, they've got a lot more options. They've got 4 or 5 guys I'm confident in, and I can't really say I've had that many players I wanted at that spot over the last 5 to 6 seasons.
Shout out Mike Clay, man. We've come a long way on this show of just calling for his job to saying he was the best coordinator on this team far and away last year. And he's going to have a lot of athletes at his disposal this year, not just at the returner position, but at those kick coverage positions as well, Lou. And that's how guys are going to sneak themselves onto the roster is special teams. It's the third phase for a reason. And with Cooper DeJean, it's such an interesting conversation because he's not really a guy that sneaks his way onto the roster, right? But he's a guy who has a pivotal role and can use that skill set as a returner. When you were talking about that, there was one guy I was thinking about. I'm like, that's how they used DeSean early on. It was like, okay, we know he's going to have a big role moving forward, right? Let's see if we can use him as a returner for 1.5 years before the league kind of catches on to him.
And they
maybe
did.
That's how they kind of approach it with Cooper DeJean, and then all of a sudden they can transfer that Ainias Smith and that Will Shipley now that they've kind of caught up to the NFL speed once Cooper DeJean really cements himself as that guy on defense.
Yeah, and maybe you do kind of like what you did later on in D-Jack's career, like his first time in Philadelphia, where you don't use him as often. He's not your every single time punt returner, but maybe in certain key situations.
Yeah, when we need a play, put Coop out there. Yep.
Exactly. Like it's close in the fourth quarter, and you really need a return. That's when you put Cooper DeJean out there. Maybe that's an idea, and you do it.
Maybe they start with more or 2 returner sets as well with these new rules, Lou. Like maybe we're not just talking about one guy. Like you get back to that world where you can play with 2 guys on the back end, and I'm sure there's going to be all sorts of new wrinkles, like maybe like fake reverses and handoffs and the end zone and stuff with these new rules. I'm excited to see how it kind of evolves in the NFL, but it's not the years where we're saying like, oh, Reno Mahe is our best returner anymore. I mean, Kenyon Barner was great in his role, but was he still one of the best in the league? No, he wasn't one of the top guys in the league. No,
he was efficient, but yeah, the Eagles were at the bottom of the league in this area for a long time, and I don't think that'll be the case this year, just like it wasn't last year for sure. They've got a lot of options. Excited to watch them battle that out as well in the summer through training camp and the preseason. We got you covered right here on Locked On Eagles Monday through Friday for all those storylines. Thanks so much for making us your first listen each and every day. Until tomorrow, I'm Lou DiBiase. He's Gino Camilleri. We're signing off. Thanks so much for downloading, watching, and listening. And as always, let's go Birds.
Fly, Eagles, fly.